All right, so welcome back. This is going to be the last part of our notes on Chapter 20 regarding progressive reform. Today, we're going to focus on the other two presidents of the progressive era, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And that'll be it. I'm going to say it again, even though it never works, but hopefully this video will be a little bit shorter. And then we'll get everything done, ready in some time to get ready for the coming test. So let's go ahead and hop right to it. All right, so in 1908, we have an interesting situation. Teddy Roosevelt has now been president since 1901 and emerged because of the assassination of William McKinley. And even though he wasn't elected to that first term, Roosevelt pledged that he would follow what was called the George Washington precedent of only serving 2 terms in office. Now, because of the 22nd Amendment, that is required that you can only run or have 2 terms as president. There's no limit to how many times you can run. But back then it wasn't an amendment yet. So Roosevelt pledged that he would consider that first 4 years as a full term, and after his second term starting in 1904, he will consider himself serving 2 full terms as president. Roosevelt was very much a historian, someone who valued the history of the country and the precedents set. And believed in the magnitude and fortune and importance of the presidency and didn't want to do anything to disturb that in any way. So as the end of his presidency draws near, which ended kind of not badly. The book says it was, the book kind of talks about how, he might not have gotten the nomination. I don't know if I feel the same way about that. Roosevelt was largely loved, but in any event, he determined he was not going to run for another term as president. Instead, in 1908, he kind of handpicks William Howard Taft to be his successor. Okay, it's kind of a handoff, right? Everybody loves Roosevelt. Roosevelt says Taft's my guy. Everybody says, okay, we love Taft, and he runs for and he wins. He wins election in fairly easily in 1908 against William Jennings Bryan, who was running for president for the 3rd time. Roosevelt liked Taft basically because, and this is how I kind of break it down, because he was very similar to Roosevelt without nearly the personality. So essentially, Taft would continue to do the things that Roosevelt would have done, but he wasn't going to overshadow Roosevelt in any way. And Roosevelt was fairly cautious, to a certain degree during his presidency. He did break up a lot of trusts, but he also, gave everybody a square deal and treated people fairly and stuff like that. So he felt Taft would do the same. But early on in his presidency, Taft kind of broke from what Roosevelt kind of thought he would do. This begins with something called the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which was a tariff that kind of was insignificant in terms of what it actually did. Of what it actually did, it lowered tariffs in some areas, but increased them in others. But a true progressive would have done more to affect or lower that tariff. So progressives kind of start to get a little bit weary of Taft here. Okay, so that is kind of strike number 1. Strike number 2 against Taft comes in terms of something called the Ballinger-Pinchot dispute. Now, we talked about Gifford Pinchot last time. He was the leader of the U.S. Forest Service and a big ally of Roosevelt because Roosevelt was such a conservationist. Now, the controversy comes when Taft replaces the Secretary of the Interior, whose job it is to kind of manage like national parks and basically internal issues within the country, Secretary of the Interior, gets rid of uh, James R. Garfield and replaces him with a guy named Richard Ballinger. Um, and basically, Ballinger was very conservative and wasn't nearly the conservationist, so he gets into dispute with Pinchot, who is, if you remember, the conservationist guy. There's accusations that go back and forth between the two, um, and ultimately Taft essentially sides with Ballinger in the matter and fires Gifford Pinchot, who was again a very pro-Roosevelt guy. Now, I'm not going to give you too many names here because it'll just make this all confusing. But basically what this means is that we're seeing evidence that essentially Taft is not doing as Roosevelt would have him do. William Howard Taft was a good man, but he never enjoyed being president. He much more enjoyed his later role as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and was much more a modest man when it came to his presidency. So that created a lot of problems with him, especially stepping into the shoes of Roosevelt and trying to be like Roosevelt. Making matters worse and being the last straw for both Roosevelt and progressives were William Howard Taft's aggressive stances against trusts. Where Roosevelt looked at trust as some good and some bad, Taft opened up more than twice as many antitrust lawsuits as Roosevelt did, and more aggressively went after some of these existing trusts. And of course, Roosevelt doesn't like that. And so basically, that's the last straw, and that ultimately is what's going to bring Roosevelt back into politics. The most notable trust that Taft broke up or went after was the Standard Oil Trust, which of course was controlled by John D. Rockefeller, and that was the biggest trust probably ever broken up in the history of the U.S. Okay, so obviously all this stuff, Taft turns out not to be the guy that Roosevelt expected him to be. That creates conflict, and Roosevelt determines that the only thing he can possibly do is jump back into the game. So ultimately, he starts talking about Taft a little bit and how he doesn't agree with his policies, and starts going around the country giving speeches about what he calls his new nationalism. In his new nationalism, Roosevelt basically argues that a lot of the things that we talked about before with like social justice and like social gospel and issues like that, essentially saying that it takes a firm, strong political leader, which in Roosevelt's view Taft was not, to ensure the good of all American people, or as Roosevelt put it, for the public welfare. Basically saying, ultimately, I'm the only guy that can save you. And Roosevelt basically says, you know, to strengthen America, you need a strong president and a strong leader. Taft has not been that guy for you. I can be again. So here we are in 1912, and Roosevelt is running for president. Again, jumps into the Republican process, Republican primaries, winning several state primaries, and seemingly having a lead over Taft to get the nomination in 2012, or in 1912 rather, when kind of like the Republican power figures, the old guard as they call it in the book, that would be like today's version of like people like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all the established folks in the Republican Party, instead of going with Roosevelt, who they knew they wouldn't be able to control and wouldn't be able to do the things they wanted to with. They take all the disputed electoral votes and give them to Taft, essentially saying, we don't care, you know, what the people say. You know, we're going to give all the disputed delegates, all the disputed delegate votes that happened at the convention. We're going to give it all to Taft. Okay, which is something that theoretically can happen in a primary election. There's many times where it goes to numerous ballots in a primary election to determine the winner. This is an example This could have been an example of one of those times, but Roosevelt basically takes his people and walks out of there and says the heck with it, and Taft goes ahead and gets the nomination. Roosevelt then goes out and forms a third party, which is actually called the Progressive Party, but Roosevelt, in starting the party and nominating himself for president, refers to himself as a bull moose, and that's how the party kind of gets its name, the Bull Moose Party. So that's kind of the story with that. So I hope that makes sense. Because I know it's kind of confusing there, but if you have questions about how delegates work and something like that, we can go over that as well. But essentially, putting this all together, Roosevelt expects Taft to do his bidding essentially and keep going the things that Roosevelt did. Taft doesn't really follow up the way Roosevelt expected him to, so Roosevelt gets back into politics, but the establishment Republicans don't want to give Roosevelt the nomination because he's too hard to control, so to speak. So he starts his own party to try to get the nomination that year. So, couple images. Obviously, this is kind of Puck magazine. Again, was that one that kind of was a big political satire magazine. This is an image of Teddy Roosevelt here and William Howard Taft here, with Roosevelt kind of handing off his policies, his policies to Taft. And making sure Taft isn't going to, screw with them in any way. And then big stick diplomacy, which we'll talk about next chapter. You see the guy walking out with Roosevelt's big stick. And then here's the election results from 1912. So as you can see, a couple things to note. First of all, we have 4 candidates that get a substantial enough portion of the vote. We have Eugene Debs, a socialist, that gets almost 1 million here, 900,000 votes. You have Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson. Another thing to note here is how low turnout has gotten relative to other years. Less than 60% actually show up to vote this time. Wilson wins in a landslide electoral vote, but he only wins about 42% of the popular vote because Taft and Roosevelt basically split the Republican vote between the two of them, which, if you would have only had one of these guys, they probably would have won, and there you have it. This is the only time, I believe, yes, this is the only time in American history where you have 3 people who would be president of the United States running, for the general election on the final ballot. You have the guy that wins who becomes the new president. You have the current president in Taft. You have the former president in Roosevelt. So there's 3 presidents that are on this ballot, which is something that we hadn't seen before or since in American politics. And Wilson ends up winning in a landslide. So let's talk a little bit about the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. So the funny thing about Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft is at the end of the day, they're all progressives, and they're not super different from one another. Wilson is a Democrat, and basically Roosevelt is a Republican, as is William Howard Taft. But they all advocate for progressive change. Wilson, while Roosevelt has his new nationalism, Wilson has basically his version of the same thing, which he calls his new freedom. Essentially, in Wilson's new freedom, what he's advocating for, which is a little bit of a departure from Roosevelt and Taft, is that trusts and monopolies are really bad, and one of his primary objectives as president is going to be to kind of break them up and end them. Woodrow Wilson's a little bit different. His background is in education. He was a college professor at Princeton, then university president, and then became governor of New Jersey before he became president, whereas most previous presidents were, pretty much all previous presidents had either been lawyers, farmers, or military guys. So he kind of comes from a little bit different background. So his goals with this new freedom include kind of the further regulation of monopolies, a little bit more so than his predecessors had done. He basically wants to destroy monopolies altogether in favor of government regulations that control businesses from becoming monopolistic. Okay, where Roosevelt kind of said, and Taft to a lesser degree kind of said, okay, we'll go after monopolies that are bad, but if there's ones that aren't bad, we'll just leave them be. Wilson believes that monopolies in general are a bad thing and they have to kind of be gotten rid of. Progressives, of course, love this idea. Okay, this is something they've been arguing for a long time, right? A lot of progressives are former members of the Populist Party, and they advocate for, obviously progressive changes that are going to be beneficial to most people, and or beneficial to more people, in particular farmers and middle and lower class folks. So anything that is bad for the rich, in the minds of the average American, it's good for them. Um, Wilson also is very much a scholar as president, in that he enacts a lot of significant change. Revisionist history of Woodrow Wilson is much more skeptical of him because he had some racial insensitivities which were unfortunate, apparently, and but he did a lot as president of the United States and really helped form the country as we know it. One thing he goes after are tariffs. He figures, tariffs create a lot of problems and they're not a secure source of income consistency for the country. So let's find an alternative. And finally pushes for the income tax, another old populist demand that finally Wilson pushes through with the passing of the 16th Amendment, which which allowed for an income tax to be created. Now today, the maximum income tax that somebody can pay is about 38%. So 38% of the money that you make in a year, depending on how much you make, because it's a graduated tax, could be taken. The maximum back then it could be was 6%. So certainly way different than what we have now, but becoming less dependent on tariffs, which creates a lot of economic instability, and more on an income tax, which is a more stable way of federal income, ends up being something that turns out to be, as much as we hate income tax, fairly beneficial. Wilson also starts the final move to kind of ultimately get away from the gold standard, which again is another thing that the old populists, would have probably advocated. Wilson pushes for the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is of course what we have today. We're not totally off the gold standard by this time, but we're gradually moving away from it, and we would be totally off of it, I believe, by the 1930s. And in it, essentially, what we create are Federal Reserve banks around the United States. Sounds very similar to the sub-treasury program, again, that the populists had supported. So there would be 12 Federal Reserve banks around the United States, which would essentially house the money that would be used by banks in that particular region, if that makes sense. Okay, so in other words, the closest Federal Reserve Bank to where we are here is in Cleveland. So we're, I think, in the Cleveland region. So the money that's in your banks that you go to is provided and supported by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. If you look at money that you have in your wallet, it shows which, by letter number, the first 12 letters, A through L, it shows all the Federal Reserve banks that there are. Chances are a majority of the money that you have, or the most of all the ones that you would have, would come from Bank D, because that's the one that's in Cleveland and is closest in proximity to us here. So the Federal Reserve System is created, changing the way money is made and distributed, and slowly moving us off of the gold standard for good. Wilson also creates something called the Federal Trade Commission. Okay, the Federal Trade Commission's goal is to basically be another regulatory agency to determine the legality of trade between anywhere in the country, whether or not actions taken by a company are legal ahead of time. So that would be an anti-monopoly type move. That would be something to ensure that the actions of the federal government aren't met with any sort of illegal apprehension or anything like that. So what we're seeing here is a lot of what we call government regulation, which becomes in the 20th century really a big hallmark of democratic principle. Government regulation, government oversight, stuff like that. And, certainly people have different feelings about the effectiveness of these, particularly the FTC. And then finally, though, one thing that was universally good is Taft enacts new child labor laws, which basically, regulates, again, child labor and puts penalties in place for employers that work or employ underage children illegally. Even penalties in place for people trying to sell goods over state lines that are made by, children, I think, under the age of like 14, I think, or something like that. But in other words, we're starting to see a lot of these progressive outcomes realized, goals of the people that we talked about in the last several chapters. Now here by about 1914 are largely realized. Child labor laws in place. Some of these things the populists wanted, like sub-treasuries, kind of, and regulation of trade between states. Income taxes, graduated income taxes. So we see a lot of this change, a lot of it for the good, and generally, making people happy. So that's it for chapter 20. Certainly, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, let me know, and obviously we'll cover most of this stuff in class. All right, so we'll see you later.